Welcome to the channel. Today's story texts out to attend Thanksgiving dinner. Is greater than, is greater than. My name is Avery Collins, and I'm 31 years old. By the time my father slid the notarized contract across the Thanksgiving table, I already knew this dinner had never been about turkey, gratitude, or family. It was a staged execution with catered side dishes. My mother stood at one end of the table like she was chairing a board meeting instead of passing cranberry sauce, and my sister sat 2 seats away in a white satin bow and a ridiculous rhinestone tiara, smiling like she was waiting for applause. There were 50 people packed into my parents' lake house near Lake Y. Uncles, aunts, cousins, in-laws, church friends, people who loved watching a family crack as long as it happened over good china. Then my father tapped the paper and said, "Pay the $78,000 for your sister's wedding, or leave this house and don't come back." My mother rose so fast her chair scraped the hardwood. "Every person at this table agrees," she announced. "You owe her this." My sister tilted her head and gave me that practiced sugary smile I'd known my whole life. "I already booked the venue under your credit card," she said. "So really, you're just making this harder than it needs to be." When I didn't reach for the pen, my mother grabbed my plate and dumped my dinner into the trash. "Freeloaders don't eat here." My father calmly picked up my car keys from the counter and tucked them into his pocket. "The car stays until you decide to do the right thing." 50 relatives watched me like I was the entertainment between dessert and football. I stood up, buttoned my coat, and said one sentence that turned my mother's face white. "You might want to call the venue before you call me ungrateful." I walked out before anybody could stop me because the first thing I understood was that panic would help them, and calm would help me. I spent that night in a plain roadside hotel 20 minutes away, still wearing my coat, still replaying the way my mother said every person at this table agrees, as if a crowd could turn coercion into love. By morning, my phone was packed with missed calls, voice notes, prayer emojis, and messages from relatives who had not checked on me in years, but suddenly felt summoned to mediate. I did not answer any of them. I locked every account connected to my parents' address, requested replacement keys for my car, flagged my credit, changed emergency contacts, and sent a clean warning note to human resources at work because I knew exactly what my family did when private pressure failed. They escalated in public and then acted wounded when anyone documented it. The voicemails told the whole story. My mother complained that I had embarrassed Christian people on a holy holiday. My father said I was unstable and needed to come home before this became permanent. Madison cried that I was ruining the most important season of her life. Not one of them said they were sorry for cornering me in front of 50 witnesses. Their problem was not that they had been cruel. Their problem was that I had left before the contract became enforceable. 3 days later, my cousin Leah sent screenshots from the family group chat. My parents had posted a long statement saying I was going through something emotional, that I had misunderstood a loving family request, and that people should pray for reconciliation. Madison added a broken heart and wrote that she still loved her sister. That was the moment I stopped treating the dinner as a horrible scene and started treating it as a pattern I could map. I built a timeline the way I handled risk files at work. Dates, screenshots, flagged card activity, old texts, holiday incidents, loan requests that became demands, promises to repay that turned into silence. The deeper I went, the clearer the structure became. Madison wanted something expensive. My parents translated it into duty. I hesitated. They escalated shame until giving in felt easier than resisting. Only this time I had finally walked out before the ritual was complete. A week into that process, I got a message from a number I did not know. It said, "Hi Avery, this is Ethan Mercer, Nolan's cousin. I think your parents have been using your name with my aunt and uncle. We need to talk before they lose more money." I met Ethan at a coffee shop in Fort Mill the next afternoon, and within 10 minutes I understood my family had widened the blast radius. Ethan showed me messages between my mother and Nolan's family, claiming I was handling a family trust disbursement, that I had quietly committed to major wedding costs, and that I preferred not to discuss my generosity publicly. It would have been laughable if it had not already moved real money. Nolan's parents had advanced $22,000 for catering and guest accommodations because they believed my contribution would cover the venue, decor, and photography. When the venue flagged the card issue, my mother told them I was having a mental episode and had frozen things impulsively. Hearing my life translated into a financial fiction should have devastated me. Instead, it clarified everything. My family had not simply tried to pressure me. They had built an entire storyline around my wallet and my silence. Ethan was exhausted, not theatrical. He had his own history with Madison, promising reimbursement and leaving someone else to absorb the loss. He told me Nolan knew something was wrong. His parents felt conned, and nobody trusted the explanations coming from my side anymore. I told Ethan I would share everything I could prove, and nothing I could not. That was enough for him because facts were already more than my family had offered anyone. That night, I drafted a calm message to Nolan and his parents, explaining that my name and finances had been used in false representations about the wedding, and that I had never committed to fund any part of it. Nolan's father replied within half an hour and asked for a private meeting the next morning. His one line stayed with me. If what you are saying is accurate, this has gone far beyond a family disagreement. He was right. The next day, I met Nolan, his mother, and his father in a private room at a country club restaurant, because discretion still mattered to people who had not made chaos their religion. I laid everything out: the flagged account, the old unauthorized user attempt, the timeline, the Thanksgiving contract, the confiscated keys, the plate dumped into the trash, the voicemails, the family group chat, the message to my employer anticipating retaliation. I told them I had never offered to pay for Madison's wedding, never managed any trust, and never authorized a vendor to use my card or my identity. Nolan listened like a man trying to decide whether heartbreak or humiliation hurt more. His mother watched me with the focus of someone trained to spot exaggeration, but the truth was too organized to mistake for performance. Then Nolan played a voicemail. Madison had left him complaining that I was dragging my feet on the release and that if he handled his family, she would handle hers. His mother's face changed. His father stepped out, made several calls, and came back with the posture of a man moving from manners to action. Catering was suspended. Guest accommodations were suspended. Their attorney would review every representation made by my parents. Until that review finished, there would be no wedding. Before I even reached my car, Madison had called 16 times, and my mother had texted, "How dare you go to them?" My father wrote, "Fix this now, before I make it worse." The group chat exploded when Nolan's mother sent a short message to close relatives on both sides, saying that serious financial misrepresentations were under review and no further payments should be made. It was precise, devastating, and impossible to spin. That night, Madison came to my apartment in full makeup and total collapse. I did not let her in. I stepped into the hallway, closed the door behind me, and let her say the quiet part out loud. She started with tears and venue cancellations, then florist panic, then Nolan refusing to answer. When I told her her lies had finally caught up with her, she snapped, "Our lies," and froze. That single syllable said more than an affidavit. Then she whispered the one thing she had never said to me like a sister. "Please do not let them think I did this alone." I looked at her and understood that she had spent her entire life believing I would eventually solve whatever indulgence my parents promised her. That belief was not love. It was a business model. I told her she had not done it alone, but she had done it. She slid down the hallway wall crying, and I went back inside. I did not feel triumphant. I felt finished with carrying what other people built on my back. By the next morning, the wedding was not wobbling. It was collapsing. Once Nolan's family stopped shielding the narrative, my parents lost the audience that made shame effective. So they escalated exactly as I had predicted. My father called my office reception pretending there was urgent financial misconduct involving me. Security documented it, and human resources warned me immediately. My mother emailed one of my senior directors from a private address, claiming I had embezzled from relatives and was inventing stories to avoid repayment. Because I had already briefed work, the email was preserved for legal review and nobody at my company treated the accusation like gossip. My director replied once and told her any further contact belonged with counsel. That professional wall rattled my parents more than any emotional confrontation could have. For the first time in their lives, they had run into people who did not care about family hierarchy and only cared about records. My father's voicemails shifted from anger to panic. He said people were asking questions. He said Madison was falling apart. He said my mother could not sleep. In one voicemail, he said, "You do not understand what this will cost us." I listened to that line 3 times because it was the closest he had ever come to understanding my life. Meanwhile, relatives who had stayed silent at Thanksgiving started writing privately. An uncle admitted he had always suspected my parents were harder on me than necessary. A cousin confessed my mother once asked whether he could pressure me into co-signing a short-term family note. Aunt Paula, who had watched my dinner hit the trash and said nothing, sent a message that simply read, "I should have stood up for you." It was late and small and still mattered. Silence feeds systems like mine almost as reliably as cruelty does. I decided then that I would not rage online, and I would not start a rumor war. I sent one measured email to the relatives who had attended Thanksgiving, and to the family members directly involved afterward. Attached was a short statement and supporting proof that I had not agreed to fund Madison's wedding, that my name had been used without consent, and that retaliation had extended to my workplace. Screenshots did the work. The contract, the preserved outreach to my employer, the family chat. The response was immediate. Relatives who had enjoyed the spectacle did not enjoy realizing they had sat through a public extortion ritual and called it tradition. Then the vendors began comparing communications. That was when the financial damage started surfacing in numbers my parents could not pray away. The venue kept part of the deposit. The florist had non-refundable sourcing costs. The live band carried a penalty clause. The tent company wanted full cancellation charges because installation had already been scheduled. Private reimbursements to Nolan's family were now on the table. Once everything was counted, my parents were looking at well over $100,000 in losses, penalties, deposits, and obligations they had assumed would vanish as soon as I signed. Their plan had always depended on my compliance arriving before the paperwork did. Without my signature, consequences had names and due dates. That should have ended the illusion, but families like mine do not surrender cleanly. They look for side doors. Over the next several days, my father tried to rebuild leverage through people he thought I might still care about. A pastor from my parents' church left me a careful voicemail about forgiveness before full information was known. An aunt asked whether I could at least advance a smaller amount to preserve dignity for both houses. One of Madison's bridesmaids sent a long message saying stress made everyone act badly and that a true sister would not let one disastrous holiday ruin a wedding. The language changed, but the expectation stayed the same. I was still supposed to trade reality for harmony and money for quiet. Meanwhile, the groom's family was doing its own review, and every hour of that review made my parents look worse. Ethan kept me informed because once he started comparing dates and claims, he realized the lies had not been improvised. They had been layered over months. My mother had told Nolan's aunt that I preferred to keep my generosity private because public gratitude embarrassed me. My father had implied he was holding funds in temporary reserve until a tax window closed. Madison had assured vendors that Avery always worried at the end and always paid once the spotlight felt close enough. My reliability had become part of their sales pitch. It was such a familiar violation that I almost missed how insane it sounded out loud. I was not even present for most of these promises, yet my personality had been turned into a payment plan. On the Monday after Thanksgiving, Nolan's father called me again and asked whether I would answer a few follow-up questions from his attorney. I said yes because by then the choice was simple. Either I let my family define the record, or I helped create one they could not revise. The attorney wanted dates, copies, and direct answers. Had I ever promised any amount? No. Had I ever discussed a trust? No. Did I have reason to believe my card information had been accessed or represented without consent? Yes. Had there been prior incidents involving financial pressure from family? Yes. The call lasted 37 minutes. When it ended, I did not feel exposed. I felt legible for the first time in years. Facts have a strange mercy to them. They reduce shame by giving it proper names. That same afternoon, Leah sent more screenshots from the family chat. My mother was furious that outside people were asking for documentation. My father said documentation was not the point because family was built on trust. I stared at that line for a full minute. Trust, according to him, meant allowing unverified claims to travel in my name as long as the right people benefited. Madison was less philosophical. She asked whether anyone thought I would settle if they framed it as a temporary bridge loan. Then she wrote that I had plenty in savings and was only pretending this was about principle because I enjoyed humiliating her. That message hurt in a way I did not expect. Not because it was new, but because it proved she had never once mistaken my restraint for sacrifice. To her, my stability was just unused inventory. At work, I kept doing what had always saved me. I followed routine. I answered emails. I reviewed reports. I attended meetings. I let professionalism become a spine while the rest of the story thrashed around outside it. My manager never asked for more explanation than I wanted to give. He only made sure security had names, legal had copies, and no one at the company had to field family contact alone. I cannot overstate how healing it was to stand inside an institution where boundaries were not treated as cruelty. The contrast made my whole childhood look different. I had grown up believing love required access, that privacy was suspicious, and that the price of being considered good was being continuously available. Then, one calm office in Charlotte treated my parents like any other source of documented harassment, and suddenly the mythology collapsed. By midweek, the financial unraveling had turned social. People who had once admired my mother's ability to organize charity events and control a room began stepping back. A church committee quietly removed her from a holiday fundraiser. An old family friend canceled a couple's trip with my parents after hearing that the groom's side had involved attorneys. My father, who cared about public image the way some people care about oxygen, started leaving voice messages that sounded less like commands and more like someone trying to stop a leak with his bare hands. In one of them, he said, "You are making strangers think the worst of us." I almost texted back that strangers were only thinking what his own actions had finally made easy to prove. Instead, I archived the voicemail and moved on. Madison tried a different route. She sent me a message that was longer, calmer, and almost convincing. She said she knew our parents had mishandled things. She said weddings warped people's judgment. She said she had counted on me because she thought sisters were supposed to show up for each other when it mattered. For one dangerous second, I felt the old reflex rise. Not guilt exactly, conditioning. The part of me trained to interpret any softer tone as a chance to restore order. Then I read her message again, and noticed what was missing. No acknowledgement of the card. No admission of the lies told to Nolan's family. No apology for telling 50 relatives I was selfish for refusing extortion. She was not reaching for truth. She was reaching for a cheaper strategy. So I did not answer. The next pressure point came from people who had been neutral until neutral became inconvenient. One uncle wanted me to remember that women in our family had always sacrificed so the group could save face. A cousin suggested that even if I was right, broadcasting family mistakes would stain everybody for years. That sentence landed with a clarity I wish I had found earlier in life. Broadcasting family mistakes, not committing them, not benefiting from them, broadcasting them. In my family, the greater sin was never harm. It was proof. That insight changed how I heard every appeal afterward. None of them were asking what was just. They were asking, who would carry the embarrassment? Historically, the answer had always been me. This time I declined the job. My mother finally came to my apartment alone in a wool coat with swollen eyes and none of her polished holiday confidence. I did not invite her in. She asked me to stop this, in the same tone people use when they want reality to pause until they feel ready. I told her I had not started this. She said they were trying to help Madison. I said they were trying to use me. Her face folded inward, not because remorse had finally appeared, but because the sentence was too clean to argue with. Then she said they had handled it wrong. Not that they were wrong, just that they had managed it badly. Even her apology was operational. I told her that was exactly the problem. To her, cruelty was a strategy issue. She reached for my arm. I stepped back and listed what had happened in language so plain she could not hide inside euphemisms. You told 50 people I owed Madison my life. You threw away my dinner. You kept my car. You contacted my workplace. You lied to another family in my name. You do not need forgiveness right now. You need reality. She left without another word. 3 days later, Madison's wedding was officially canceled. Nolan ended the engagement through attorneys and one brutally simple email saying that material misrepresentation and loss of trust had made a future impossible. My parents had tried to force me into a lifelong payment. Instead, they pushed their favored daughter into a public collapse they could not rescue. A couple of weeks later, Madison asked to meet at a park by the lake. Winter had stripped everything down to branches and cold light, which suited the conversation. She looked smaller somehow, like the golden child version of herself had finally run out of stage lighting. She told me our parents were blaming her now, vendors were furious, Nolan's family had cut contact, and our father was saying she had misunderstood the plan. The plan, even then he talked like this had been a scheduling mistake instead of a moral one. Madison laughed once, bitter and thin, and said she had been raised to think she deserved more than everyone else. She had not understood that our parents would let her walk off a cliff if it protected their image. That was the first honest thing I had ever heard her say about our family. Then she asked if I could talk to everyone and tell them she was not the only one responsible. There was shame in her voice now, but there was still also habit. Rescue had always been my job. I told her she was not the only one responsible, but I was not going back into that system to soften consequences for the people who built it. She cried quietly this time, without performance in it, and said she had thought I would always come through. I said I knew, because our parents had trained us both on the same lie from opposite sides. She was taught entitlement. I was taught endurance. We sat in silence long enough for the water to flatten again, and for once the silence felt like a border instead of a wound. A week later, my father asked for a meeting and I declined. Then my parents arranged a family video call with close relatives and said they wanted to make a statement. I joined out of caution, not trust. There were around 20 people on the screen, many of the same people who had watched Thanksgiving like it was a holiday sport. My father looked older. My mother looked furious at having no other move left. Then, in clipped, imperfect sentences, they finally said publicly what they had refused to say privately. My father admitted I had never agreed to fund the wedding. My mother admitted they had involved relatives improperly and made financial assumptions in my name. My father acknowledged that contacting my workplace had been unacceptable. The call lasted maybe 8 minutes, but it changed 31 years of gravity. Afterwards, some relatives apologized. Some tried to soften everything with talk about pressure, wedding stress, or misunderstanding. I did not argue, and I did not let them rename what happened. That was the real shift. The wedding ending mattered. The money mattered. The apology mattered less than the fact that I had stopped negotiating against my own memory just to keep everybody else comfortable. The fallout kept moving through their lives after that. My parents had to repay parts of Nolan's family's expenses, cover vendor penalties, and absorb the humiliation of being quietly sidelined in church and social circles where they had once controlled the mood of the room. My father sold the classic car he loved to cover obligations. My mother canceled a renovation she had been bragging about for months. Relatives stopped volunteering money. Nobody trusted a family arrangement anymore. It would have been poetic if it had not also been so ordinary. The people who spent years treating me like a private emergency fund finally had to finance the consequences themselves. As for me, I took a promotion in Richmond and moved into a bright apartment with giant windows and no room for inherited guilt. The first Thanksgiving there was quiet and almost boring, and I loved every second of it. I set a table for friends who never once made me earn my seat. Halfway through dessert, I looked around and realized nobody was keeping score. Nobody was setting a trap and calling it tradition. Nobody was pretending love required a contract, a threat, or a public humiliation. That is what stayed with me more than the wedding collapse ever did. Peace was not dramatic. Peace was ordinary. Peace was a room where no one wanted to invoice my existence. People ask whether I ever forgave my family, and the truth is, forgiveness stopped being the center of the story the day I chose reality over role-playing. What mattered more was understanding that being the strong one in a toxic family often just means being the easiest person to exploit. The moment you stop carrying what everyone else piled onto your back, they call you selfish, cruel, dramatic, heartless, disloyal, everything except what you actually are, free. My parents said pay $78,000 or leave. Weeks later, they regretted saying it, not because they suddenly understood love, but because for the first time in my life I let consequences travel all the way back to the people who created them. And once I did, everything real stayed standing.